Okay, we're going to continue on with special types of parallelograms. So a rectangle, a rhombus, and a square are all special types of parallelograms. So first of all, when you're talking about the sides of each of these special parallelograms, we're going to make ourselves a little extra box down here. And we're going to say because these are parallelograms, I'm going to abbreviate with the symbol parallelograms. Then we know opposite sides are parallel, and that's the symbol for parallel, and congruent. So that was a theorem. So by definition, I know that all of these opposite sides here are all going to be parallel. You could even mark it in the picture for all of them. And all of the opposite sides are going to be congruent. So those are congruent, these are congruent. And most of us already know that about a rectangle and a square. Rhombus, some people have trouble with the rhombus, remembering what that is. But what's special about a rhombus with the sides is that the definition of a rhombus is that you have four congruent sides. So in other words, all of the sides are congruent to each other. So the definition for a rhombus is that you have four congruent sides. Now, they're still also parallel and opposite sides are also congruent, obviously here, but the definition of a rhombus is that there are four congruent sides. Okay, square is a combination of a rectangle and a rhombus. But for a square, again, a square would be a type of rhombus. So they would also have four congruent sides. Okay, now all three of these would be parallel and also congruent. Okay, angles. So again, because, and we're going to make ourselves another little extra box at the bottom. But again, because all of these shapes are parallelograms, then you know, so we can even write it again. So because these are parallelograms, then opposite angles are congruent. Okay, so I would know that, and don't write this yet, but I would know this angle is congruent to that angle, and these are also opposite congruent angles. Now, in a rectangle, what is special about a rectangle, so I'm going to erase these, is that you actually have four right angles. Now, right angles are 90 degrees, so these are still going to be congruent to each other. But that is what's special about a rectangle. And so the definition, I'm going to abbreviate that just as def. The definition of a rectangle is that you have four right angles. Okay, for a rhombus, all we know for a rhombus are that opposite angles are congruent. Okay, these do not have to be right angles. So for a rhombus, all I know is what I know from a parallelogram. Now a rectangle, a square, is actually a type of rectangle. It's also a type of rhombus. So for the square, I'm also going to have four right angles. Okay, and then the definition for a square is a combination of a rhombus and a rectangle. So for definition of a square, you're going to have four congruent sides and for right angles. Sorry, you're going to have to cram that one in there. Okay, looking at the next thing, diagonals. So let's just draw ourselves a nice little line here. Because these are parallelograms, again, here's the symbol, then we know that diagonals bisect each other. Sorry, bisect each other. Okay, so we could mark that in the picture. So I know that these two guys and these two little segments are congruent. And then you can mark that on all of them like that, right? And then for a square, this is kind of a special case. But because the diagonals bisect each other, and we're going to talk about this in a second, but the diagonals are also congruent in a square. You could actually mark all of these the same, only for a square though. Okay, the next piece of information for specialties of a rectangle with diagonals. The diagonals are congruent. When you have a rectangle. So in other words, if I had letters on these, let's say this is A and this is B and this is C and this is D, I would know that AC is congruent to DB. Okay, and that's only if it's a rectangle, but because a square is a type of rectangle, so that also applies to the square. Okay, what is special about a rhombus is that the diagonals are perpendicular. There's actually another thing we have to write, but diagonals are perpendicular. The symbol for perpendicular is this upside down capital T. I'm not sure if we did that yet, but that means perpendicular. Okay, the other thing about a rhombus is that the diagonals actually split the angles into congruent angles. So that means this little angle and that little angle are the same. And so are this little angle and that little angle. All four of those little angles are congruent to each other. You could also do it on this side. So I'll put two curves and two curves, and then two curves and two curves. So the diagonals, I'm going to abbreviate this slightly, diags bisect the angles. Okay, so that's what all those little teeny angle marks are for. Now again, because a square is a type of rectangle and a type of rhombus, everything about these diagonals also applies here. Okay, so what we can usually say is all rectangle and rhombus properties apply. Okay, so a square is very special in that way. Anything you can do with a rectangle and anything you can do with a rhombus also applies to the square. Okay, good job. So these are the notes for special parallelograms, and we will practice that in class.